Okay, so this year, if you came to EPIQ last year, we showed a beta version of Quorum Studio, our new technology for accessible graphics, and it was definitely a beta. There was a lot of work left to do, but let me silence those for just a moment on my end. And it was definitely a beta. We were just getting started, but since that time, of course, pausing didn't actually do anything. That's okay. Since that time, we've made significant advances for toward getting Quorum Studio where we sort of want it. And so this year, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over sort of what the technologies are that we're going to be using this year and how we put them together. So the first thing is, for about 10 years ago, we were using an environment that we called lovingly Sodbeans, which was basically Oracle's NetBeans, but with some accessibility stuff in there. And that environment worked for a long time. I mean, Oracle's technologies were never really very accessible, to be frank. And any kind of accessibility we put into them was almost like a Band-Aid to try to make it as good as we could, but it was never really what we wanted it to be, just as sort of the nature of the beast. It got a community started, and it got us, a working version of Quorum, but it was also not quite what we wanted. And finally, we feel like in the community, Quorum Studio is now stable enough that we are finally retiring Sodbeans forever, and that is going past the wayside. Even on our development team internally, all of our work on Quorum Studio is actually built in Quorum Studio, so it builds itself and then can do that kind of work. So if you're using Sodbeans, we won't support that anymore because Quorum Studio is just better in any particular respect, especially from an accessibility standpoint. And so it is end of life for Sodbeans at this point. So what does that mean we're moving to? So that means we're moving to Quorum Studio 2.0. And I mentioned very briefly in the last talk some of the features. I'm going to go through them in a little bit more detail just so you kind of know what you're getting into. But on the screen, there's an image of Quorum Studio, and it has inside of it typical menus: file and edit, view, navigate, run, team for Git support, Windows, and help. And there's also a grid up on the screen. And that grid contains in it a map, which is all graphical. And that all graphical map has screen reader support built into it so that you can move around graphics and you can do stuff. The idea being you can then make games for your scenes. Make scenes for games and stuff like that, and then load them inside of Quorum 8. This is in addition to the normal editor features and stuff like that we have built into the system. So I kind of want to go through what you can do now, especially in the newer versions of Quorum Studio, so that you can kind of have a sense of when we get to the programming, what we're going to do over the next couple days. And the first is, now in Quorum Studio 2, you can build what's called a scene project. And the scene project, all it really does is embed a blank scene into your project that you can then go ahead and create using either a screen reader or not, or drag and drop or whatever you want, to build out these maps accessibly. It's built into the new project window, and there's only one option for it right now, which is to make a blank scene project, which has the scene built in. This, by default, takes a file called scene.qs, and you can, of course, make as many of these as you want and load in as many of them as you want. And it puts it inside of your project so that you can open that with the scene editor and then adjust it visually or orally with the screen reading devices. So the point is, there's now a scene project that you can use that is in addition to game. And personally, I will say that these new projects are a lot easier than trying to remember the position of every drawable for writing games, or every graphical item in these scenes. It's a lot easier than I think it used to be. And hopefully you'll agree, but we'll see. Besides that, there's now, inside of Quorum Studio 2, there's a thing called a palette, and there's a thing called a grid. And so I want to mention what those are briefly individually. One of them is the palette. So one of the ideas that we've had over the last few years is a lot of tools especially K through 12 education. They do a lot with basically drag and drop style environments, and they want to get to like block style coding, like Scratch or Code.org's App Lab or Snap. There's other tools like that. And we wanted to find a way that we can have these palette-like devices that do work through drag and drop, but also make them fully accessible. So believe it or not, the palette is actually our first version where we have the ability to do drag and drop, and then also the ability to have a screen reader and keyboard accessibility. So what you see on the screen is actually what from a screen reader perspective will look like a tree. It'll just say that it's a tree, that you can have all the normal ordinality and cardinality type issues and things like, features and stuff like that. But visually what you observe is that there's basically a tree with a bunch of images in it. If you're sighted, and you can drag and drop these things. If you're in a screen reader, you can press hotkeys like enter to select them, and then you'll move them on the grid and stuff like that. The idea is we're trying to have our cake and eat it too. We're trying to make it so that if you're a child, like my 8-year-old daughter, and she wants to basically drag and drop an item, she can do that. But if you're blind, or maybe even still pretty young, you can participate too. And you wouldn't even know that it's accessible. It just is magically both. That's sort of the goal. Besides that, there's the grid. And what you see visually on the screen is just a bunch of lines on the screen. And that is basically indicating grid positions. And these grid positions are like 0, 0 is the bottom left of a gray square, which indicates where the camera is. So effectively what you see right now, if you can see it, is there's a gray box, which indicates the camera position for a game. And inside of that is this grid, and that grid maps to the sizes of the items in the palette. And when you try this, what you'll see this means is you can basically press enter and then select a spot, and it'll add like dirt or a tree or a monster or 2 monsters or whatever the case may be. Now, besides a palette and a grid, in addition to being able to set items and move them around, we also wanted to make it a little bit easier and accessible to adjust the properties of items in your game. So one of the advantages of environments like Unity 3D online is that instead of just writing code for all possible properties of your graphics objects, you can basically set them using a normal user interface, and the code is kind of taken care of for you behind the scenes. So in this particular case, what I see now is on the screen, there's a monster. It's cute, it's adorable, you love it. And that monster is in the bottom left corner of the grid, and I've placed it on there. Inside of the monster, when I've selected it, I've pressed the key combo, which is Control plus P or Command plus P on Mac. And when you press Control plus P, it pulls up a properties box. And inside of that properties box, I can set things. So I can change its name. I can change its position in X, Y, and Z coordinates. And Z means sort of something funny in 2D, but I'll get to that in the sessions. There's the scale. How big is it in X and how big is it in Y? There's the rotation, which is in degrees, Looks like the chat's popping up. I'll make sure that I'm not missing anything. Where's the camera pointing? I'll get to that at the end of the presentation. I'll free for you to make question times. Oops. So inside of physics, there's also this thing that says physics enabled. So instead of having to write code for all of the physics, one thing that you can do now in the newest version of Quorum Studio is you can tell any particular object that you want to enable physics. You basically can just turn it on, and then it's magically there. And then it gives you a series of options: unmovable, non-responsive, and responsive. And these properties, they basically allow you to control how your object reacts. So for example, an unmovable item would be something like a floor or a terrain that never moves. A non-responsive one might be like a moving platform. It might move, but it doesn't like get whacked and tossed out of the way if physics goes. And then there's responsive, and this means like if it gets hit by something, it should actually move, right? And then you can set also properties like mass, friction, or restitution. Restitution is like how bouncy something is. So besides that, in Quorum 8, we also wanted to make it so a lot of this sort of positioning code and properties style code, which is never really very interesting to write. Like, it's important, it's how these games work. We wanted to make it so you didn't need to write that code to just get started anymore, so that you can focus on your game logic as opposed to, you know, just like this goes at position 0, 0, this goes at position 0, 1. So what you do now is when you make a scene, instead of having to then code it, you create the scene, and that lets you do that accessibly. And then when you run your game, that automatically loads the scene, puts it into your game, and you don't have to write any code for that. It's just kind of auto magical behind the scenes, handling all this positioning code for you. And so that's built into Quorum 8. But besides that, there's a bunch of other stuff that we've been working on. One is the scene support, like I mentioned. We've also been working on what's called basic data science. And that includes, Quorum now has a statistics library, or at least a very basic one. The idea being, if you're doing work for Common Core at your institution and you're handling things like regression or t-tests or other statistical things, some of my students are studying very closely how humans interact with data science libraries. And I've been writing the statistics for them as well. And part of that is built into Quorum 8. There's also some input system changes that allow you to add other features. So for example, we added drag and drop mouse support. So it's ironic, we often build the accessibility support first. So it's kind of adorable that we didn't get drag and drop until this release, but we always do the accessibility first. And in addition, we've made a whole bunch of accessibility enhancements inside of the input system to improve affordances, make the editor work a little bit better, and stuff like that. Besides that, we made an absolute massive number of changes to the accessibility system behind the scenes. This involved literally a complete rewrite of our accessibility system compared to last year after lots of feedback. And also, we had significant help from a fellow named Matt Campbell out of Microsoft, who sort of took pity on our small team and said, wait, I think you're doing this all wrong and this all wrong. And oh my goodness, was that really helpful in making the accessibility system work as well as it does today. And in fact, I'm pleased to say that Microsoft has graciously allowed us to do another hackathon with Matt in the next month or two, and we're going to be adding some other cool stuff that I won't announce yet until I know that it actually will work. So, in any case, this accessibility rewrite, the most important thing about it is that this rewrite allows us to make any kind of graphics accessible. It doesn't matter that it's hardware accelerated. It doesn't matter that it's some custom animation. This gives us hooks into the back-end operating system to make pretty much any kind of graphics accessible at this point in time. There's still some code that you have to write in order to make all your stuff accessible, but it's not much, and it's way, way easier than it's ever been before. So it's a hard problem if you can imagine. Oops. Okay, besides that, there's two other things with that I think are fun. One is, if we run into any problems during Quorum Studio, during the event this week, we wanted to make it a little bit easier for everybody to get their installations. So we wrote a automatic update system, and here's how it works. In order to get the automatic updates, you have to be logged in inside of Quorum Studio, and that's your normal Quorum account online. And that just checks the server to see if it's there. And if you then check for updates and there is one available, it will automatically download it and then pop up the installer for you so that you can get the absolute latest that is being used. Besides that, we added a sort of quote unquote live on the edge beta program. And while there's no beta right now because we just released the latest, the idea is that the Quorum team behind the scenes, we always make like an internal track of versions of Quorum Studio that we're kind of just experimenting with as we kind of play with features and like send them off to people to test for us and just get feedback. And we decided this year, or by popular request, frankly, to make this public. And so what we've done this year is there's a sort of magic flag you can set to get onto the beta program, and it's open to the public. Anybody can get it at any time. And whenever we make installers for ourselves, we put it on now this beta program for the internal team as we experiment with features. And now it lets anybody else do that too. Now, keep in mind, the beta is like literally our experimental stuff, but it's also the latest features. So if you're interested in sort of living on the edge or living dangerously or whatever you want to call it, then you're welcome to, we can show you how to set the beta flag in your Quorum Studio installation and do that sort of thing if that's your bag. Besides that, we noticed last year, super helpful, staring at people's computers as they use Quorum Studio. I can't tell you how helpful it was to look at Sarah Larkin's computer as it was using Quorum Studio last year. I mean, just world changing in terms of helping us understand what to do. And what we realized is that in order to account for different kinds of machines, we needed to spend quite a bit of time improving CPU usage and especially memory usage. It's kind of a boring thing to talk about, but I'm just mentioning it because it's something we've been doing. Notably, Quorum Studio 2 should actually work a lot better on older machines than even Sodbeans did. In my testing internally for small projects, the memory consumption is around a gigabyte, which in NetBeans, the old Sodbeans tool, it was about 2.5. So that's considerably less that memory usage than we've ever had before. If you're loading big, giant, beefy projects and you're using the scene editor and you're doing all sorts of stuff, then it does take more memory, but that's to be expected. Besides that, we've also spent a lot of time on trying to figure out sort of the optimal CPU usage for the system. And there's a couple ways that we've done that. One is we just spent a massive amount of time tweaking it to try to make it less sort of CPU hungry. But in addition, we've also changed the frame rate. So it should make computers get less hot if they're using the GPU. And also it should make it work a little bit more efficiently. But importantly, if for whatever reason on your particular machine, you need Quorum Studio to run like faster at a higher frame rate and stuff like that, this is all now totally tunable. And you can adjust these little properties files you have to change your frame rate on your end if you just want to for your particular machine. But on mine, I set mine to 30 frames a second, and that seems to work pretty dang well across any machine that I've tossed it on, so at least so far. In any case, the point is we've done just a massive amount of time trying to make it so that these Quorum Studio 2 should work better on older machines, just in general. Besides that, I know some of you, especially, I'm sure this is true in other places too, but in the Maryland School for the Blind, I know that they do team projects. And I was just thinking this year, I really wanted to sort of better support these kids when they're doing work on teams, like with Legos and stuff like that. And so, and I actually wrote this feature, so if it breaks, let's blame Sina Baram. But if this particular feature is Git support, this automatically can connect to both GitHub and Bitbucket. And you put in your passwords in a property window in your project, and that gets stored encrypted on disk so that people can't easily get your passwords and stuff like that, just using normal encryption techniques. This has normal operations to like connect to these things. So these are things like push and pull. This is like send to the server or get it back. Adding, which is like put files into my team's repository, and then also committing files, which is sort of changing things locally, and also getting the status of what this is. Besides that, there's also a new thing called editor annotations for Git support especially. And these editor annotations, they basically, even if you can't see the screen, it will give you information about what you changed compared to the public repositories. So on the screen, there's actually a little blue square, a little green square, and you can jump between them, and you can also request information from the editor about these annotations on particular lines of code. Now, I want to be clear, this feature is brand new, and it's I suspect what we're going to want this year is to get some feedback on other features that you want and how to make it more accessible and stuff like that, just like we always do at Epic. But nonetheless, I'm hoping that it will make it a lot easier for any of you that are doing team projects to make like public repositories, send back and forth information on your teams. And I'm really hoping that this will help, especially like the Lego robot teams and stuff like that for this coming year. But I would encourage all the teachers that are having kids do things like games, put those on GitHub too, and have your kids contributing to these games in a public setting, because it's just a lot of fun to do that, because sometimes you can get like community feedback from open source. You can get people sending you code, and that kind of experience for a kid especially would be just a lot of fun, I think. And so I would encourage you to consider using some of this Git stuff when you teach, because it's kind of a blast. I like it myself too, and I use it every day. So, okay, so then the next question is, what do we do for the new releases? And so we have, if you aren't aware, the number of requests we get for features related to accessibility and other stuff from Quorum Studio, you can imagine, is literally in the thousands. We get tons and tons and tons and tons of requests for features all over the country. but we're a relatively small team, and we try to basically take all the requests and do two things to prioritize them. Number one is every year we talk to people and we do focus groups at EPIQ to try to figure out what the blind community especially cares about in terms of features for the next year. And for this year, those things are going to be on Thursday. If you're willing to do an interview with us, we're going to have me and some of my students do interviews with everyone to see what things you care about so that we know how to prioritize for next year. But in addition, there's also some things that have just kind of bubbled into the community that we think we want to support for the next year just in general. So I want to give you an overview of those. First is we've already released Quorum Studio 2. That was last week. And the next thing that we know we have to do because of the way our grants are structured for how Quorum is funded is where the College Board has made significant changes to computer science principles. This is the AP test nationally. Quorum is part of the AP. You can look that stuff up. And the 2021 changes have changed the whole system dramatically. And code.org, who's our partner on this, has given us permission to change all of their new curriculum over to Quorum. And so we are working on that. There is some complexity with that. Notably, the new version of computer science principles is actually using a lot of data science inside of it. And of course, data science is not inherently accessible. So what we've done is we've invented an accessible data science library, which is one reason why there are statistics built into Quorum this release. And for the next one, we're hoping to have all sorts of accessible charts and graphs that are there. And I've been doing some, we've been doing some user testing and some, not user testing, we've been doing some testing internally, and we're hoping over the next couple months to do user testing, perhaps with some of all of you, but also to get feedback on how this kind of charting and graphing comes together. The idea with this accessible charting is basically, you know, if you've got a bar chart, that shouldn't just be an image. That should be like a way of connecting accessibly and then getting the information from the bar charts. Intent long-term is to collaborate with people like Jenna so that if you're using this on desktop and you're using JAWS or NVDA, it works there. And if you're on a tablet, you get the tactile affordances as well. So Jenna and I are working on a grant to the National Science Foundation to try to build that in the next release or two. In either case, we have some prototypes of accessible charting working for a couple different kinds, and we're working on that to support that, hopefully by probably December. And the computer science principles updates is actually next on the dev schedule because we got to finish that before school starts, because there's a ton of people that use Quorum's computer science principles stuff online. I mean, probably 50, 60,000 people is what I would guess. I don't know exactly how many, but it's a lot. And so we have to get that stuff up and running before school starts for sure. Besides that, in the first version of the scene editor, we only added 2D support. And there's a really good reason for that. And that is because in user testing, once we actually started putting this out for people to try the scene editor and get feedback, especially accessibly, well, we had a bunch of feedback on various kinds of ways to support this. And we were able to finish all the changes for 2D, but we haven't quite finished them all for 3D. They're actually pretty easy to do, basically just ways of controlling the cursor and controlling stuff like that. But there are still questions we're trying to figure out, like what should the keys be for 3D? How do you control, you know, the various dimensions and stuff? How do you query? How do you get information? So 3D support isn't quite finished, but it's not going to be a ton of work to do it. And so we're probably going to put that into the next mini release, which we're hoping will be around December. Now, besides this, for Quorum Studio 3, I think the most common request, and on Thursday, you can tell us that we're all wrong and that we should focus on something else, but I think the most popular request amongst the broader community for Quorum is to get blocks. And this is like code.org style app lab or you know, Scratch type things built in. And so we've been working in creating our palettes and stuff for this, but we're hoping, we don't know for sure, but we're hoping to add a block style mode directly into Quorum Studio for next year. So that if you're more comfortable using code, you can. If you're more comfortable using a block style interface, you can just kind of turn that on or off in the next version. Now, again, this is a roadmap. We don't know for sure that all this tech will work how we want. We don't know for sure that, you know, nothing will go wrong, or, you know, that Corona will get us all, or Lord knows what. But nonetheless, that's our intent. And so as of right now, that's kind of what we're thinking for the next release. But like I said, on Thursday, we would love, love, love to get feedback from all of you, because it's the only way we can make our tools better long term, as to what you want us to work on is really important to me personally, and as is for the rest of the team too. So okay, so this slide just says let's go break stuff.